30 teams, 15 matchups, over 60 wide receivers. I'm going to be talking through that you should be starting or sitting going into week 6 of the fantasy football season. Hopefully you got a dub in week 5. If not, there's still plenty of fantasy football to be played. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get straight into it with, by the way, before we get into it, actually, 2 teams that are on bye weeks, okay? The Packers and the Steelers. So Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon, Najee Harris, George Pickens, Jalen Warren, Kenny Pickett, Jordan Love. The list goes on, so make sure you plan accordingly as you go into week 6. And the first matchup of the night, Thursday night football, Broncos at the Chiefs, a good divisional game. Anything can happen. 51.5. Chiefs are favored coming into Thursday night. And let's start at the Broncos side of the ball. Jerry Jeudy is a risky start coming in for me. Now, he has been improving week in and week out, has been seeing a higher snap percentages, and every week his highest snap percentages off this injury, 86%, catching 6 out of 7 targets, over 11 fantasy points. But we do have to understand he did play the Jets, who gave up the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Now, to be fair, the Chiefs are still a good defense who give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. I think it gets a little bit better, but since they're going to have to be scoring in this game to somehow keep up with the Kansas City Chiefs, plus it's a divisional game, so anything can happen. He is my risky, quote-unquote, must-start wide receiver depending on your depth at your team. Now, Cortland Sutton as well, 1 out of 3 targets, under 3 fantasy points this past week. Very disappointing. I'm assuming it's because Sauce Gardner was on him for the majority of the game. I think he can also have a better game, but somebody I do deem as a risky start coming in. And Marvin Mims, not somebody I'm confident starting as well. So he is a must-sit. Going to the Chiefs side of the ball, and this is all based on if Travis Kelce is going to play. What is good is that he got injured, went out of the game, came back into the game with a quote-unquote high ankle sprain. Hey, if he doesn't play, I think the best wide receiver that you could start, who is a must-start / risky start, is a Rashee Rice coming off of this week. 4 out of 5 targets, found the end zone, over 13 fantasy points. My biggest concern with Rashee is the snap percentages. He is still seeing the least, or if I'm not mistaken, the 2nd least amount of snap percentages out of the wide receiver room, behind Sky Moore and, oddly enough, Kadarius Toney. When Kadarius Toney is healthy, he can average a little bit more snap percentages, but we just haven't seen him on the field. But Sky Moore is the one I do want to talk about, because I do believe he is getting the highest snap percentages of this team, but he is not getting the opportunities that we all expected him to get. That's why I do believe he is a risky start as well if Travis Kelce is not playing. If Travis Kelce does play, I am not starting Sky Moore. I am not really confident in starting Rashee Rice coming in, but I do believe if you are in a 14, 16-man league, we could have this conversation even if Travis Kelce is starting. All right, our next matchup, all the way in London town, Ravens at the Titans. Ravens are favored coming into this game with the over-under being 41. And the only wide receiver I'm excited to start on this offense, on this team, is Zay Flowers. This past week, caught 5 out of 11 targets, over 12 fantasy points. His highest target game so far, and I think he could have had a better game, just like anyone else on this team. You have to think about all the drop passes that were left on the field from Lamar's skilled players. It was so frustrating. And if Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Mark Andrews, and Nelson Aguilar would have caught those deep ball passes or those chunk play passes, we would be having a different conversation about this team, about these skilled players. And that's exactly what we need to take into consideration. I think they will have a bounce back game, especially as they play the Tennessee Titans, who's currently give up the 8th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So he is a must start coming into this week. And the other person I do want to talk about, since OBJ has been struggling with injuries, Rashad Bateman also struggled with injuries, was in and out of that game as well, but also struggling with the chemistry and living up to the expectation that we all expected with the chemistry of Lamar Jackson. I think Nelson Aguilar has the best chemistry left that is on the team that is healthy, to be completely honest. Caught 5 out of 4 targets, just under 10 fantasy points. Something similar with Zay Flowers. If he catches those bomb passes, we'll be having a different conversation about Nelson Aguilar. And we saw those type of things in week 2 against Cincinnati, where he caught 5 out of 6 targets. He found the end zone over 17 fantasy points. I think that's what's exciting about Nelson Aguilar. He's only a risky start if you, once again, have a deeper league, 14, 16 man leagues. He can be somebody you can pop into a flex. So obviously OBJ and Rashad Bateman, like I kind of spoke about, I am not starting with confidence whatsoever. Going to the other side of the ball, DeAndre Hopkins, his best game so far this year as a Tennessee Titan, caught 8 out of 11 targets, over 22 fantasy points, 140 yards in the air. And that's exactly what you wanted to see from DeAndre Hopkins in this offense. Now, they are playing the Baltimore Ravens. The Colts are a little bit better when I say as in they give more points to the wide receiver position. That's exactly why DeAndre Hopkins was a good start coming into last week. But now they are playing the Baltimore Ravens, who are significantly better, a middle of the pack defense when it comes down to fantasy relevant wide receivers. I would deem him a must start, but you start him with some caution, because don't expect him to have a 22+ point game. Expect him to have more of a 10, I would say, to 15 point game, and be okay and confident with that 15 points from DeAndre Hopkins. All right, let's go to our start of the Sunday slate games. Commanders at the Falcons. Falcons are favored here, over under 42 points in this game. Starting at the Commander side of the ball, a risky start for me. That is Terry McLaurin, just purely because he is going against AJ Terrell. You saw what he did against Nico Collins, even though Nico had a better game than what I expected him to have. But you had to look back at where we saw with Calvin really in London, where Calvin only caught 2 out of 2 targets, didn't have the best fantasy game. Once again, he is going against AJ Terrell. You have to envision Terry McLaurin going up against him and AJ traveling with Terry. Something also that was very disappointing with Terry this past week, caught 4 out of 5 targets, just under 9 fantasy points. It says he played 83% of the snaps, which feels like a complete lie, because I felt like the whole third and fourth quarter, I didn't see Terry in the 2-minute drill. I didn't see Terry in those opportunities where Sam Howell was driving down the ball, because Terry wasn't on the field. You know who was on the field? It was Curtis Samuel, who was a must start coming into this week. As you know, I do believe AJ Terrell is going to shut down Terry, as we saw with Calvin and a little bit with Nico. Curtis Samuel should eat into this offense, coming into this week, caught 6 out of 7 and a touchdown, over 18 fantasy points. It's crazy to say that Curtis Samuel is the second best wide receiver on this offense. Not saying he's the second most talented wide receiver in this offense. He's the second best wide receiver for fantasy in this offense, ahead of Jahan Dotson, who is a must sit so far for me coming in now to this year. Somebody that I drafted all over in a lot of my leagues, and I am so frustrated because was not expecting the way for this to pan out this way, right? It's been pretty frustrating. Has only scored over 12 or over double-digit fantasy points in one game. That was against the Philadelphia Eagles, which saved his game, literally the last play of the game, to go into overtime, where he scores 12 fantasy points. He's not living up to expectations with Sam Howell currently. It's clear that Curtis Samuel is a favorite, and Curtis Samuel and Logan Thomas are both favored for Sam Howell in this offense. So Jahan Dotson, a must sit, Terry McLaurin, a risky sit, and Curtis Samuel, a risky start for Terry, and a must start for Curtis Samuel. Going to the other side of the ball with the Falcons, Drake London, 6 out of 9 targets, over 14 fantasy points, 78 yards. Drizzy Drake, Rodgers, and Desmond Ridder are looking significantly better, and that's exactly what you want to see, especially going against the Commanders, who currently give the 3rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. You have to expect this is another home game, and they've been playing decent at home, and that's exactly what you want to see here. And I think this could be more of a shootout, especially because I think the Commanders are good against the run, even though we didn't necessarily see that too much with Khalil Herbert and Roscoe. Obviously, we did see that because they went down, but I think this run defense is significantly better, which can stop Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, which may result in the Falcons throwing the ball a little bit more with Drake London. So starting with confidence going into week 6. All right, our next matchup for Sunday, Vikings at the Bears. Vikings are favored 49.5, the second highest over under this week that we have so far. And Vikings are favored, but I do believe the Bears could sneakily take this the way Justin Fields has been playing. I don't know, maybe I just have a little soft spot for Justin Fields here. Let's start at the Vikings side of the ball. Obviously, the biggest caveat here is with Justin Jefferson. If Justin Jefferson does play, you start him, but it doesn't look like he is going to start. Reports already coming out as I'm recording this saying that his chances are very slim to play on Sunday. So the next man up is Jordan Addison, who we saw caught 6 out of 9 targets, found the end zone for over 18 fantasy points, his best fantasy finish so far this year. And I do believe that can easily improve, especially with Justin Jefferson, who is leaving a significant amount of targets behind when he is not on the field. Now, I do believe Jordan Addison does take the next step, but you anticipate Kirk Cousins spreading the ball out a little bit more to TJ Hockenson and also to KJ Osborne. And now KJ Osborne is a risky start for me. I would say that if you're in a deeper 14-16 man league, this could be somebody that you can flex, because they are playing the Bears, who currently give up the 11th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, and KJ caught 5 out of 9 targets, just under 10 fantasy points. Very similar stat line to Jordan Addison. The difference is Jordan Addison is finding the end zone, right? KJ Osborne didn't find the end zone this past week, which I do believe could change if, once again, as the Chicago Bears do give up the 11th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So a risky start there. Going on the Bears side of the ball, a smash start, in my opinion, coming into this week. DJ Moore against the Vikings, who currently give up the 4th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Currently wide receiver 4 on the year so far. 49 fantasy points on the dot against Washington on Thursday night. Caught 8 out of 10 targets, 3 touchdowns, a career game for DJ Moore. I think that can easily, I won't say easily continue. I think him and Justin Fields are just finding their stride, which I'm really excited about. So you start DJ Moore with confidence. All right, my next matchup, Seahawks at the Bengals. 43.5 Bengals are favored coming into this week. Seahawks coming off of this bye week, so they're getting healthy. The offensive line is getting healthier. They're getting more pieces on the defensive side of the ball. So don't expect this game to be easy peasy for the Bengals. Seahawks side of the ball here, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, you start these guys with confidence. Okay, obviously this past week, or before they went on the bye, excuse me, DK called 3 out of 4 targets, over 12 fantasy points, finds the end zone. The one play that has been disappointing so far, not really living up to what we expected, I would say, is Tyler Lockett. Only had that boom game against Detroit in week 2, over 25 fantasy points, 10 targets. The rest has kind of been there, but he hasn't been getting over 10 fantasy points in those last 3 of the 4 games that he has played. So something to look out for. Tyler Lockett still a must start for me, and keep that in mind. JSN, once again, still haven't seen it, but we could see an uptick, as we always say, after the bye weeks. Normally bye weeks for teams, rookies do see an uptick in production. Do we see that with Jason coming into this week? I'm not necessarily sure. He is a must-say, a wait-and-see type of approach if you have Jackson Smith and Jigba. Going to the other side of the ball there, Jamar Chase finally had his boom game. 15 receptions, 19 targets, over 52 fantasy points, 3 touchdowns. Welcome back to the NFL, Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. That's exactly what we wanted to see. Wide receiver 5, literally, I feel like off of that one game, even though he had a good game the past 2 weeks, but still, like, wow, what a phenomenal game. You start Jamar Chase, you start T. Higgins if he does play, which I do believe he will be out coming into this game. We'll wait to see how he progresses throughout the week. A guy that I want to say could be a risky start that had a somewhat of a decent game with T. Higgins out is Tyler Boyd. Caught 6 out of 7 targets, just under 10 fantasy points. If you are struggling at the wide receiver position, especially as they go against the Seahawks, who currently give up the 2nd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, if T. Higgins is out, I think Tyler Boyd could be a good flex option going into week 6. All right, the 6th matchup so far of the week, 49ers at the Browns. 49ers are clearly favored, 41.5 coming into this game. Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, I think you have to start him with confidence, even though these guys kind of been boom or bust. Deebo dealing with the injury. Really more Deebo is a boom or bust. Week 4, barely seeing the field, seeing the field with 87% of the snaps, but seeing less than a fantasy point. in that game. In week 5 against Dallas, caught 3 out of 3, but over 11 fantasy points, getting those big chunk plays, the yak opportunity for Deebo Samuel, which kind of saved that week for you, even though it wasn't the best game. So you start Deebo with confidence. You kind of have to expect this to happen. The Browns do give up the least amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Maybe that continues, or maybe they get found out this week against Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk, you start with confidence, obviously moving forward. Going to the other side of the ball here, Amari Cooper and the Browns coming off of a bye week. Amari Cooper against Baltimore didn't have the best game. Obviously, that was because DTR was in the game. Deshaun Watson did not play. A last-minute frustration for me as well. Like, they reports coming in to that week saying, well, it will be a surprise if Deshaun Watson doesn't play. Next minute, he doesn't play. What do you mean? I thought he was going to play. You were so confident. Anyways, it's a whole different conversation. I don't want to talk about it because I lost a lot of fantasy matchups because of Deshaun Watson. Anyways, look, you start Amari Cooper. If Deshaun Watson plays, you start Amari Cooper. Now, if Deshaun Watson doesn't play, because there has been a report as I'm recording this video saying that he did not practice on Monday, and if he does practice on Tuesday, that seems significantly more exciting and I feel a lot more confident starting Amari Cooper. But if he doesn't play, I'm not necessarily sure if I want to start DTR versus the San Francisco 49ers or whoever the backup quarterback would be for this team. And Elijah Moore, if once again you do start him, in my opinion, I do believe he is a more risky start in a lot of people's eyes. For me, he's a must start because he's getting the targets. You eliminate the game in week 5, week 1, 7 targets, week 2, 9 targets, week 3, 9 targets, right? He's getting the targets. He's not getting those big chunk plays. Now, can he get the yak yards after the catch ability? He can. They're just not setting him up for success. They're more quick out routes towards the sideline where he catches the ball and he runs out of bounds. I think if they get him into the middle of the field, we can see some more exciting plays. Does it happen this week against the 49ers? Probably not. Probably why I would understand why you should deem him as a risky start, but in my eyes, a little bit more of a must start coming in if, once again, Deshaun Watson plays. All right, the next matchup, Saint versus the Texans. 40.5 Saints are favored coming into this game. Let's start at the Saints side of the ball. Chris Olave, who had a better performance than week 4, but still disappointing in a lot of people's eyes. Under 10 fantasy points, caught 5 out of 2 targets, but he did find the end zone the first time this season. Derek Carr was struggling, but at the same time, what was game script? Right, this team was up 30-3 or 30-0 if I'm not mistaken at this game, and it was early that they had to run the ball, and that's exactly what they did. So they really didn't have to throw the ball. Now going against Houston, who do give up the third fewest amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position, you could see Chris Olave struggle, but you have to anticipate that this Houston Texans offense can score the ball significantly better, where they're gonna have to try and throw and pass and try and score as well for the New Orleans Saints. So keep that in mind. His teammate and Michael Thomas, look, not someone that's exciting, has been healthy so far throughout the season, averaging over 10 fantasy points per game outside of one game week 4 against Tampa. But he's been seeing, last week, 4 out of 7 targets, over 10 fantasy points. He's a decent flex moving forward. It's not exciting by any means, but somebody that's saying, hey, my players are injured, or I have George Pickens, or whatever the case may be, Michael Thomas could be somebody you can flex. I think he is a risky start, but hey, if you need that opportunity, definitely start him if you need to. Going to the Texans side of the ball, Nico Collins, I kind of mentioned earlier against AJ Terrell, called 3 out of 4 targets, over 6 fantasy points this past week. Now he's going to New Orleans, who is also a tough matchup here as well. I do believe he will have a better game because, look, CJ Stroud is the truth, and he is going to be scoring. He's going to be throwing the ball as much as he can, especially if his teammate Tank Dell is not 100%, right? 3 out of 4 targets, over 8 fantasy points, but he did miss some time with that concussion. Does he come back in time to play in week 6? I'm not necessarily sure, but I do believe if Nico Collins and Tank Dell are both healthy, they're both must starts moving forward to me for week 6. Okay, the next matchup, 8th matchup so far, we're getting through it, guys. Colts at the Jags. Jags are favored over under 46 points. Let's start at the Colts side of the ball. Obviously, the biggest storyline in this team is Anthony Richardson could potentially go on AR with a grade 3 joint sprain, which is pretty gruesome. Not gruesome, but that just sounds terrible. I mean, that must really hurt. I could imagine him struggling, sleeping, you know, even picking up like a fork to eat, all these things. I don't know. That's what I think of. I'm not a doctor. Michael Pittman. Look, Michael Pittman, somebody that I was not expecting to be just as good with Anthony Richardson or Gardner Minshew, but that's exactly what we're going to be seeing here. Tennessee Titans this past week caught 5 out of 7 targets over 10 fantasy points. But when, you know, Anthony Richardson did leave the game in week 3 and Gardner Minshew stepped in, he caught 9 out of 11 targets over 16 fantasy points. It all wasn't Gardner Minshew, but I think in a full slate game with Gardner Minshew playing the whole game, you can easily see how he can sling the ball, and might be a little bit more exciting and a little bit more, hey, I feel more confident in Gardner Minshew giving me some fantasy relevant points for my wide receiver. Maybe that's my bias because I wasn't expecting Anthony Richardson to be so good, which has been great so far, don't get me wrong. But with Gardner Minshew, we know he loves to sling the ball. He can easily still maintain a fantasy relevant Michael Pittman. Let's go to his teammate here in Josh Downs, because I do believe this is a good flex option start, especially for Gardner Minshew, because Gardner Minshew does favor Josh Downs when you are watching this game. Caught 6 out of 6 targets, over 15 fantasy points, getting those chunk plays, averaging over 16 yards per target and per catch, obviously. But same thing, going back to week 3 when Gardner Minshew stepped in, caught 8 out of 12 targets, over 13 fantasy points that game. He's getting the targets, he's getting the chunk plays. And if you do need a flex option, maybe you're struggling to start Tank Dell, maybe you're struggling to start a Michael Thomas, maybe you're struggling to start an Amari Cooper, Josh Downs could be somebody that, you know, can fill in for those guys, to be a better opportunity for those guys as he's playing the Jacksonville Jaguars. Jacksonville Jaguars are a bit of a middle of the pack defense right now, so they're not bums when it comes down to the defensive game, but they can definitely defend the pass. Going to the Jags side of the ball here, Calvin Ridley stepped up. You know, I was telling a lot of people, I don't know, man, I'm not sure about this week. I was really worried about the Buffalo Bills, but he cooked him. Caught 7 out of 8 targets, over 120 yards. His best or second best fantasy finish so far against the Bills, over 20 fantasy points, which was great. So you start Calvin Ridley with some confidence. My next and final player that you should be starting on this team is Christian Kirk, the guy that I've been telling, hey, you could get 2 to 3 rounds later, and that's exactly what you've been seeing. He's currently wide receiver 19 on the season, getting those targets. Obviously, he had one bad game in week 1 against the Indianapolis Colts, but he steps up against Atlanta. He steps up against Buffalo. You see him averaging literally over 15 fantasy points per game since week 2, and that's exactly why I drafted a lot of Christian Kirk and why you should feel confident now. Not saying I'm happy, but you know, now that Zay Jones is injured again, he's under MRI, going to examine that knee injury. He did leave the game last week, or he didn't play last week for the past 2 weeks, weeks 3 and 4 against Houston and Atlanta, but he does come back against Buffalo, re-injures that knee, and I think he can be missing some significant time coming in the next couple weeks. So you start Christian Kirk, you start Calvin Ridley going into week 6. All right, next matchup, Panthers at the Dolphins. Dolphins are clearly favored, one of the highest scoring offenses in the NFL currently, over under 46. Once again, Dolphins are favored. Let's start at the Panthers side of the ball. Adam Thielen is the truth. 33-year-old Adam Thielen, a top 10 wide receiver, still cooking with a young wide receiver. Look, this past week, 11 out of 13 targets, over 27 fantasy points, and a touchdown. Has scored 3 touchdowns in the last 5 games so far. He's been doing his thing. He's the truth. And unless something changes, you start him with confidence, okay? And you kind of have to go. And let's go through these wide receivers for this Panthers team. Let's start off with Jonathan Mingo. 5 out of 7 targets, just over 9 fantasy points. I'm still trying to find out who is the true wide receiver 2, because some weeks it's DJ Chark, some weeks it feels like it's not DJ Chark and it was Terrace Marshall, some weeks it's not Terrace Marshall, sometimes it's Jonathan Mingo. Who is it? I don't know. So the only person I can say you can start with confidence is Jonathan Mingo, but somebody I would say that has been consistent now for the last 3 weeks a little bit would be, and the snap percentages will be DJ Chark. DJ Chark caught 3 out of 6 targets, found the end zone over 13 fantasy points, and I think that's who I will be starting as a wide receiver 2. A risky start, but not somebody I'm willing to start with confidence whatsoever. This is a deep league, right? 14, 16, whatever, however your leagues are set up. If I needed to start another wide receiver on this team, it would have to be DJ Chark. But if you're in a 12-man league, a 10-man league, I'm not starting him whatsoever. Jonathan Mingo, Terrace Marshall, you both sit. What's crazy is that Terrace Marshall comes in week 4, catches 9 out of 10 targets, and then week 5 doesn't see the field whatsoever. Not one snap on the field. That is very interesting. What is going on over there with Terrace Marshall? Maybe they're frustrated. I'm not necessarily sure. But Adam Thielen, the only wide receiver you should be starting going into week 6 on the Carolina Panthers. And the Miami Dolphins, it's not wasting any time here. You start Tyreek Hill, over 32 fantasy points this past week. You start Jalen Waddle, has a good bounce back game, his highest game so far, over 14 fantasy points. He finds the end zone. That's exactly what we want to see. And I do believe this offense might need Jalen Waddle. I was a bit concerned coming in. I was going to say, before the A-Chain's injury, I'm not necessarily sure if this team needs Jalen Waddle. I was going to say that because A-Chain has been cooking, Raheem Mostert has been cooking, and if this game is so explosive on the ground, then in the air, and their most explosive player is just Tyreek Hill, what's Jalen Waddle doing there? I do believe Jalen Waddle can easily be a top 12 wide receiver, still is. Just when are they going to utilize him? When they're down significantly, which they will have tougher matchups. They're going to play the Eagles, they're going to play the Chiefs later on, but the rest of the matchups are pretty easy. Carolina, New England, you think of Vegas as well down the road, Washington, you think of the Jets as well, even though the Jets have a good secondary, but you get what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily sure if Jalen Waddle is necessarily needed for this offense with Devon in, but with Devon going to potentially missing some time, they might use Jalen Waddle some more. So those are my must starts coming into week 6 for this matchup. All right, the start of the afternoon slate games, Patriots at the Raiders. Raiders are favored 42.5 coming into this week. Let's start off on the Patriots side of the ball. There is no one I want to start. It's been really frustrating in the wide receiver room specifically, but even if you are a Ramondre Stevenson believer, a Hunter Henry waiver wire pick-upper, you don't want to start these guys with confidence because of how bad Mac Jones and this offense has been. They're not moving the ball down the field. They seem very out of sync, out of rhythm, and Bill Belichick looks frustrated. It looks like he's about to make a massive trade for a quarterback that nobody wants, that he sees value in. That's what it really seems like, to be completely honest with you. He thinks Mac Jones is bad. He thinks Bailey Zappe's bad. He's going to pick up somebody off the street and say, let's rock with it, and he's going to be slinging. That's how I feel with this offense, so stay tuned for that one. You're not starting anyone on that offense. On the Raiders side of the ball, Davante Adams, you start Davante Adams with confidence. He didn't have the best game coming into this week, under 9 fantasy points against the Green Bay Packers on Monday night against Jair Alexander. You kind of expected that maybe a little bit, but look, you expect this guy to be what he is, wide receiver 10 so far on the year. I think he will definitely improve going into next week against the New England Patriots. Now you go to Jacoby Myers, who I personally believe is a mid wide receiver 2 that you should be starting week in and week out with some confidence. To be completely honest, caught 7 out of 10 targets and a touchdown, over 20 fantasy points. There's only one game he scored under 10 fantasy points, which was in week 4 where he caught 2 out of 4, but that was because Aiden O'Connell was in the game. That wasn't Jimmy G. That was the biggest difference, okay? And then week 2, he did miss a game with a concussion. So there is some opportunity here for Jacoby Myers, who has come out of nowhere. And I learned a lot in watching that Monday night game. They were talking about how Jimmy G, coming from the San Francisco 49er offense, he likes to hike the ball, take 2 steps, throw it quickly, which has been straight to Jacoby Myers, where for Davante Adams, you had to take your 3-step hitch, maybe 4-step hitch, and then wait for Davante Adams' route to develop, where Jimmy G doesn't like to do that, which I think forces him to make bad throws at times, where Jacoby Myers has been his safety blanket, which I absolutely love. So you start Jacoby Myers and Devontae Adams with confidence going into week 6. All right, our next matchup, Lions at the Buccaneers, 45.5. The Lions are favored down in Tampa. Amon-Ra St. Brown, if he does play, you have to start him. But if he doesn't, I think this is a good start moving up Josh Reynolds. So right now, Amon-Ra is a must start for me, and Josh Reynolds is a risky start. But if Amon-Ra does miss another game, Josh Reynolds could be and should be a must start coming in for you, in my personal opinion. Josh Reynolds caught 4 out of 5 targets and a touchdown, over 17 fantasy points. That was against the Carolina Panthers. Now, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense is, in my opinion, better than Carolina, and they can score. That's the difference here. The Bucs can't score. Not that the Panthers can't, but I think you can see them going blow for blow, which you may have to understand why Josh Reynolds might be a little bit more valuable to this offense, okay? So he is a risky start if Amon-Ra plays, but if Amon-Ra doesn't play, he jumps into a must start for me. And then Jameson Williams caught 2 out of 3 caught 2 out of 3 targets under 3 fantasy points, excuse me. We have to wait. He's going to get gradually worked in. I would say let's see him really take off and the bye week after week 10 for this team. Going to the Tampa Bay side of the ball, the Bucs coming off surprisingly a decent team so far. The biggest caveat here is what's happening with Mike Evans. I know Mike Evans left last week's game against New Orleans with that hamstring injury. We haven't heard much since with Mike Evans. We haven't heard if he's, been practicing or he's been getting treatment. We just haven't heard the severity of that injury. I think we'll get more information about it this week as the team returns to practice. But if he is a full go, you start Mike Evans. He is clearly Baker Mayfield's favorite target in this offense, and his teammate Chris Godwin. The only way I truly believe he is fantasy relevant is if Mike Evans is not in. Now, he has been averaging over 10 fantasy points in his first 3 games, and in week 4 you saw him get that uptick with targets and receptions and scoring over 19 fantasy points. But I truly believe that was because Mike Evans went down. Now, we have to wait and see what that looks like again with Mike Evans coming back into this offense if he is 100%, but I'm not confident starting him if Mike Evans is in the game. So he is deemed a risky start for me going into week 6. All right, our next matchup, Cardinals at the Rams. Rams are favored over under 46. Let's go to the Cardinals side of the ball. Hollywood Brown, wide receiver 12 on the season. I was not expecting Josh Dobbs to play like this. Was not expecting Hollywood Brown to be anywhere near fantasy relevant. Has only had 1 game under 10 fantasy points, and that was in week 1 when Josh Dobbs was with the team, if I'm not mistaken, for less than a week, and he plays and he catches 3 out of 5 targets. Ever since then, 17 fantasy points. Week 2, week 3, 17 fantasy points. Week 4, 16 fantasy points. Week 5, 16 fantasy points. Mind you, listen to the teams that he played. Against the Giants, bad. Dallas, a good secondary. San Francisco, a good secondary. Cincinnati, who currently give up, if I'm not mistaken, the 10th least amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position, a good secondary. That is the type of teams that they are playing. Now he's playing the Los Angeles Rams, who currently give up the 5th fewest points to the wide receiver position. And this team is going to have to score a divisional game that they're going to have to go up against here with the Los Angeles Rams. So keep that in mind. His teammate Michael Wilson has his big boom breakout game against the 49ers in week 4. Only sees 2 targets in week 5, which is very disappointing. A lot of people started, like myself, because I was struggling at the wide receiver position. Really disappointing. But I do believe you can see him have a better game coming into week 5, but not somebody I am excited to start, but a risky start depending on how bad your wide receiver room is. I'm not starting Rondale Moore either. And on the Rams side of the ball, Cooper Kupp is back. He looked like he never left. Caught 8 out of 12 targets, over 19 fantasy points. And Puka, also being fantasy relevant, caught 7 out of 11, over 19 fantasy points. He the one that found the end zone. I mean, was it game script because of the Philadelphia Eagles? I'm not necessarily sure. Let's see how this team operates against a worse secondary, technically. Well, technically, the Eagles do have a worse secondary in the fantasy points given. Currently the Eagles give up the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Currently, which is odd, and the Cardinals give up the 7th most. So technically, the Cardinals are a tougher matchup here for the the Los Angeles Rams, which really doesn't make any sense, but you get what I'm saying. You start them with confidence, no doubt about it. You start Puka, you start Cooper Kupp, and set and forget. All right, the last of our Sunday slate games, Eagles at the Jets, 42.5. Eagles are favored in this game, of course. You start AJ Brown, you start Devonta Smith. I know Devonta Smith had a terrible game, caught 1 out of 5 targets, and it felt like those targets were throwaway type passes, but you have to understand he's going to have a better game. Sauce against AJ Brown. Devonta Smith is going to have a lot of opportunities, in my opinion, so definitely keep that in mind. I think this game will be better than expected, but still expect Zach Wilson to struggle. So you start AJ Brown, you start Devonta Smith, and you go to the Jets side of the ball with Garrett Wilson. I would say one of the best matchups for him against the Denver Broncos, him and Zach Wilson. But it was pretty clear that Breece Hall was going to take off. We all expected it. I think everyone in the fantasy community said that he was going to pick up right where he left off last year, where he tore his ACL. He tore his ACL at the Denver Stadium. He comes back. He puts up 28 fantasy points, 22 carries, over 117 yards. He does his thing. They didn't really need to throw the ball whatsoever. Breece Hall did his thing, which really hindered Garrett Wilson. Now Garrett Wilson against the Eagles, still a decent secondary. Oddly enough, they currently give up the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. I think he's still going to struggle personally because that offensive line, losing Elijah Vera Tucker, and how good this Eagles front is. So he's a risky start coming in, but I understand if you have to start Garrett Wilson. All right, Sunday night football here. My beloved New York Football Giants versus the Buffalo Bills. It's terrible. The Bills are favored, of course. 48 is the over-under. Look, the Giants are terrible. And if there is anyone that you need and want to start on this offense, it's really just Saquon Barkley. But if you have one of the wide receivers and you are struggling at the wide receiver position with injuries, whatever the case may be, the only best start, in my personal opinion, is Wan'Dale Robinson, averaging 5 targets per game since he came back off of his injury, since week 3 to week 5, averaging 5 targets, over 7 fantasy points per game. Once again, this is more of a deeper league type of situation. I'm not starting him in a 12-10 man league, but maybe if you're in a 16 man league, I completely understand, but not somebody that I want to start with confidence. You also have to keep in mind if he's going to be coming back. I think he left with a concussion, but he should be back and healthy going into week 6. On the Bills side of the ball, you start Stephon Diggs, and I do believe I have to put Gabe Davis as a must start, but I currently have him listed as a risky start, just purely based off of this game can go away in a defensive game. This game could go away in a run game, right? James Cook can have his career game. Defense could have their career game, maybe scoring touchdowns. So Gabe Davis, a risky start, just purely based off of the game script that I am expecting this offense to really walk into, not really necessarily having to use Gabe Davis coming into this week. So keep that in mind. Still a good start, but a risky start at that. All right, the last matchup this week, Monday Night Football, Cowboys at the Chargers. 47.5. The Cowboys, are favored coming into this week. You start CeeDee Lamb. He's been flying under the radar, hasn't been having those boom games that we all expected. Only one boom game against the Jets, over 24 fantasy points. The rest has been kind of mediocre, I would say, for sure. The next player on the Cowboys is Brandon Cooks. They haven't been getting him the ball lately at all whatsoever so far this season. Has been very frustrated. If there is a game that he can have a boom game, it's against the Chargers. Why? Because the Chargers give up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Now, am I starting him? I don't think so. I think he is a risky start with a lot of question marks moving forward. But I understand if you need to start him in a deeper league. But for me, in a 12-man, 10-man league, I'm not starting him whatsoever, even based off of the matchup. Going to the other side of the ball, Keenan Allen, wide receiver 7 on the year, with Mike Williams missing some time. You start him with some confidence. Had his worst game so far against the Raiders before the bye week. Caught 3 out of 5 targets, over 12 fantasy points, but he did find the end zone, which really helped his game. And what's really good for Keenan is that he had a bye week early. I know he was kind of dinged up a little bit. He comes back a little bit healthy, but you may have to miss him a couple of weeks maybe in the season, because we all know Keenan Allen misses a game or 2. All right, in the deeper leagues, Josh Palmer, definitely somebody you could be starting moving forward, especially against the Dallas Cowboys. Even though the Dallas Cowboys do give the 4th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position, this could be a little bit different for Josh Palmer. You go to the Chargers, who one of the highest scoring offenses in the NFL, to one of the best defensive defenses in the NFL with the Cowboys. So keep that in mind. Josh Palmer probably won't get you a boom game, but probably get you 8 to 10, 12 fantasy points in a flex position. So keep that in mind. And Quentin Johnston, he is a must sit moving forward until we see that big uptick in production, guys. So hopefully I covered every single question, every single wide receiver you have on your team. Comment down below any start sit questions you have at the wide receiver, running back, any position that you are struggling with. We go live every single day, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to answer all of your fantasy start sit questions. And go to flockfantasy.com/land, the best place to support what Zach and I are doing here. Do you want 300 plus players that you need to ranked in start sit positions that Zach puts out every single week? Zach has that. Once again, flockfantasy.com/land, the best place to support what we're doing here. Not only that, you can get the fantasy hotline saying, hey, what do you think about this trade? Can you help me set your lineup? Grading teams, we do that all through fantasy hotline. So hopefully that is helpful. And as always, guys, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.